why didn't I think of that?
So, all right, well, welcome back, everyone. Uh, so, we're here today. We're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 9. It's December 10th. I realized, I kept thinking, because, when I do the video of this, I keep thinking about the fact that the date is wrong. And then it occurred to me, I could just change the date, because they put like Friday or whatever, so now I'll just put today's date up there. That way I could just look at it and I'll know right away what date it is without having to listen. But today is December 10th, and it was on this date in 1520 that Martin Luther publicly burns Leo X's papal bull Exsurge Domine. This was the order from the Catholic Church that Luther should publicly recant his 95 Theses. And so again, by this point, Luther is out there in public burning things, and so clearly the split has happened. It's interesting when you start looking at the Reformation, and I did a whole class on the Reformation here in 2017 because it was the 500th year of the Reformation. How quickly it all happened. Like he's 1517, and by 1521, there's like the Lutheran Church. There's the not the Pentecostals, the Presbyterians are in there, the Anabaptists are in there, everybody's in there. That's 1520. In 1768, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica was published on this date. And the Encyclopedia Britannica was one of the first things I purchased when I got out of college. Just something about having the Encyclopedia Britannica. I wanted my own copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So,
When was this started?
1768. So I ordered and got, and they had traveling salesmen, encyclopedia salesmen came, and somehow I got a hold of the guy, and he came to the door, and he's just saying, okay, I want this one. And so I got my own copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that was my dowry. She married me anyway. And for years that was on the shelf. I finally gave it to what's the store at 75th and Lamont, Frugal Muse, because it was like I was not using the Encyclopedia Britannica as much as I thought I was going to. Pardon me?
They took it?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
So, but yeah, it was. Started 1768. Still around. Still there. It's still. I suppose you can still buy it as a book, but it like everything else is probably entirely online. It's been a while since I've looked up that. In 1869, women's suffrage was granted in Wyoming, the Wyoming Territory, and some might argue it's been downhill ever since. I'm just kidding. Not me. I'm just saying some. Not me, dear. No.
Keep worrying about Rebecca.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just waiting for a new joke. You keep bringing out those same ones.
Oh, this is going to be a long day. I'm telling you. Thank you very much. You can go now. No, one of the interesting things about the women's suffrage, there's a lot of interesting things about that whole movement. But in 1919, I think it was, when it was put into the U.S. Constitution, there were about half the states in the Union women could vote. It wasn't like a universal women couldn't vote. There were about half the states and territories women could vote, but not in all elections. There's a really interesting, I don't know if it's Frontline or American Experience, one of those kind of PBS documentaries that kind of tells that whole story. And then in England, the women that were a woman named, I can't remember her first name. Her last name is Pankhurst. Emmeline, something Pankhurst, and a daughter. I mean, they were like blowing things up, bombs and the like, and it was, they were serious there. And I think perhaps the U.S., and there was a period of time where Alice Paul, who was kind of the leader in the U.S., was picketing outside the White House. And there's a whole, just days and days during World War I, like, how long, Mr. President, are we going to have to wait kind of stuff. But But 1869, first time women were granted the right to vote in the United States. In 1884, Huck Finn was published on this date. Huck Finn, which some have argued is the great American novel. I haven't read it in quite some time. Has anybody read Huck Finn recently? It's been, yeah, it's been a while. It's not my favorite Twain novel. I mean, my favorite Twain novel is Connecticut Yankee, but that wasn't published on this date, so we're not talking about it. In 1898, the Treaty of Paris ended the Spanish-American War, that splendid little war, as Teddy Roosevelt called it. And as a result of that, the U.S. acquired Philippines, American Samoa, the Philippines, and Guam. And thus, at this point, and Debbie and I were just talking about imperialism on the way up. This is our conversations on the way up. Let's talk about imperialism today. Okay. So the U.S. gets into the imperialism game big time here, and then start occupying the Philippines for the next 50 years or so. And it was an occupation, and there was a war. It's like 20,000 Philippines died fighting the U.S. because they didn't want to be taken over by the U.S. So whenever you hear people talk about the U.S. As anything but an occupation of the Philippines, they are not aware of what the real story is. It was a military occupation. It was not. We weren't helping them or anything. It's like they didn't want us there, but we stayed there anyway, which is essentially what imperialism is. Speaking of splendid little wars, it was on this date in 1906 that Teddy Roosevelt. Today is apparently the day that the Nobel Prize is awarded. So, December 10th, because everything is like all these different people who got Nobel Prizes. So Teddy Roosevelt got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. He was the first American, and I'm not sure what. I think it had to do with his role in trying to not the Philippine having the Philippines, but the Russo-Japanese War. I think he took it. That was in 1905. Woodrow Wilson got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for largely due to his work on creating the League of Nations, which the U.S. never joined. In 1964, Martin Luther King got the Nobel Peace Prize on this date. And in 1978, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat got the Nobel Peace Prize for the peace treaty, despite the fact that Jimmy Carter did all the work, which was kind of one of those weird sort of things. But those are all that's your Nobel Peace Prize. There will be a test on who got what. Speaking of prizes, it was on this date in 1936 that Edward VIII abdicated the English throne to marry Wallis Simpson, the twice divorced American. And the problem was that it wasn't that she was divorced per se, it was that her ex-husbands were still alive. So had she been divorced and her husband's dead, then it wouldn't have been a problem. But because the husbands were still alive, they thought, well, some people might think that's adultery, and so he's like, well, I'd rather be married to her than be king. So he abdicates. His brother becomes king. His brother dies. Elizabeth becomes queen. Elizabeth becomes queen. She's queen for 60, 70 years, and now we've got Charles. 62, Lawrence of Arabia. Has anybody seen the movie? Lawrence of Arabia premiered? Yeah, in 1962, right? Yeah. Lawrence of Arabia premiered. And in 1963, you may not realize this, in 1963, on the Andy Williams show, Donny Osmond debuts. So the first time Donny Osmond appears on TV is on this date in 1963. He was 6 years old. So it's like, you think, he's not that old. He's still out there. I think he's still doing a Vegas show. He was doing a Vegas show with his sister, but I think he's still doing a Vegas show. But he's only late 60s, I guess. So 56, he's late 60s, mid to late 60s. So you think, wow, that guy's been in showbiz since he was 6. It's like, yeah, in my class, in my film class, we watched a film clip that had Jodie Foster in it, who's someone else who started when she was 2. Her first film role, she was 2. It was like a commercial kind of thing. So somebody who survived being a child actress, I guess. I don't know. And finally, two other things. Today, Thomas Merton died on this date in 1968. Has anybody heard of Thomas Merton? He wrote a book called The Seven-Story Mountain, which is his spiritual journey, and some have referred to that as the 20th century confessions of St. Augustine. He died on this date, as did Karl Barth. Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H. Karl Barth is, if you're in the fundamental conservative Baptist universe, you have little idea of who Karl Barth is. If you're anywhere else in the Protestant universe, Karl Barth is huge. He was like probably the most influential Protestant theologian of the 20th century. He wrote a commentary on Romans and created the whole idea of what was at the time called neo-orthodoxy, which essentially is what mainline Protestantism is today. We are not technically mainline. Baptist is it's a mainline group, but as far as mainline Protestantism, what Methodism and Lutheranism and all that kind of is today. But Karl Barth died on this date in 1968. And so if you're ever going to do any study of the book of Romans, sooner or later you come up against Karl Barth's commentary on Romans. He changed it like 6 times. Or he revised it 6 times. He wrote it, then he revised it, then he revised it. And so there's like 6 different versions. And so within the world of Barthian scholarship, and that's a thing, you compare version 2 versus version 5 versus version 4 and things like that. Sort of like with what's his name? Leaves of Grass, Walt Whitman, who wrote multiple versions, revised multiple versions of his book, Leaves of Grass.
It happens to Twain's Mysterious Stranger.
Yeah. Several different versions of the story, and you kind of go, okay, what's the real version, or what's the best version, or kind of stuff.
Do you have a personal opinion on Karl Barth? Worthwhile, not?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think he's well worth the time to get to know him a bit. And one of these days, I want to do Romans in this sense, and it will. The thing about it is it may not go over well. I mean, it's depending on who I'm going to edit this part out. Depending on who the new lead pastor is, he may be very much an anti-Karl Barth kind of guy. But the guy wrote thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. He wrote a book called Church Dogmatics, and just was one of those guys who just never had an unpublished thought. And the last one there was one quotation near the end of his life. Somebody interviewed him, as I understand the story. Somebody interviewed him and said, Dr. Barth, you've written so much, you've said so much, you've studied the Bible your whole life. What's the bottom line? What's the main takeaway? And his response was, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. So this is the guy who wrote thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages on theology and church dogmatics. That was the name of his book, kind of thing, and that was the bottom line for him. So yeah, definitely worth it, I think. And going through Romans, it's my goal one of these days, and Barth's point would be definitely taken into account when we get there. So something to look forward to if we ever get through 1 Corinthians, which we're going to do. We are past the halfway point. I keep thinking I don't want to spend more time in a book than it took the author to write it. You hear stories about people who spent like a year to go through Ephesians. I'm like, I shudder at that. All right. So we're in 1 Corinthians 9 today. And like I said, we are halfway through.
Told me there'd be an ooh on it. Oh, thank you.
So, in order to understand, one of the interesting things about this today is I think we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 9 in a way that probably most of you have not. I remember one time I talked to a Bible scholar I know, met and we were talking about this different analysis or this different approach, and he said something to the effect of, if you look at something, if you hear at this point, in the 21st century, if you hear somebody say something that you've never heard before, chances are it's because it's not there. Okay, it's like, a new way of looking at the scripture, a new analysis of the text kind of thing. It's probably because it's not there. Though I don't think the fact that we haven't heard it this way doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. But you can judge me afterwards and say, on the way out, yeah, Stan, I think you were wrong there, but we'll find out. Today I'm going to start in the book of Acts. And we need to remember something, talk about a small event that took place in the book of Acts. And where it says Luke 18, that should be Acts 18. Okay? Clearly my editor failed. And when I see him, next time I'm near a mirror, I will point out to him that he failed here. In Acts chapter 18, beginning with verse 1. Now, again, we know that Paul went to Corinth and spent a year and a half there. Okay? And so here, I just want to read these 4 verses. Well, I'm going to read 5, but you'll see we'll talk about. So after this is after Paul left Athens. Okay, so Paul is in Athens, Mars Hill, altar to the unknown God, all of that kind of stuff. After this, Paul goes to Corinth in chapter 18, verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay? Now, what I want to point out is, again, on your handout, Paul arrives in Corinth and he meets Aquila and Priscilla, okay, this husband and wife team who had come from Rome. And when we went through and talked about Acts, I mentioned that here this was probably where Paul first got his idea of going to Rome, because Aquila and Priscilla were from Rome. They could talk about the church in Rome. They kind of give him, planting an idea in Paul's head, say, hey, Rome is where the action is. That's just speculation on my part. But he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who, originally from Rome, are by trade tent makers. Okay? Because a lot of living was done in tents at the time. This would be kind of tantamount to being a builder today. You make residences. It's a very nomadic area. So tent making was a very common occupation in Aquila and Priscilla. And it turns out that Paul is a tent maker too. Okay? And this, going back earlier when I talked about what it meant to be a Pharisee, being a Pharisee wasn't necessarily a full-time occupation. It could be. But it's kind of like being in a political party today. You can say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Libertarian. Okay, that doesn't mean you make your living by being a Libertarian or Democrat or whatever. It just means that that's your political persuasion. And there's an organization and there's things that it can do. And being a Pharisee was sometimes like that. And so it could very well be that Paul was a Pharisee in the same sense that would be, again, pick your political party here, okay? But you could work your way up, just like there are people who get paid to be Republicans. There are people who get paid to be Democrats, or work for the Democratic Party, or work for the Libertarian Party, or whatever party it is, okay? And so it would not be unusual for someone who could be a Pharisee and have an occupation. Okay, so Paul's occupation was he was a tent maker. Now, when we look at this text, and when we look at Acts chapter 18, a lot of times, we go, oh, tent makers, and there's this whole idea of being a tent maker, and there's a whole approach to ministry where I'm going to go do tent making. I think there's a ministry out there called Tent Makers International, where they send people into like closed countries to work, like go teach English in China, yet you're actually secretly a missionary or something like that. Different areas where they do that kind of stuff. Okay. So Paul also, one that is a tent maker, joins them and supports himself as a tent maker. All right. So again, this is a review. But when Silas and Timothy arrive, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, verse 5, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews. So Paul and Timothy come from, Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia. Paul quits being a tent maker. He devotes himself exclusively. Why? What happened? Well, in 2 Corinthians, and I give you the passage there, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, we know they brought an offering. They brought money. Okay? They brought enough money so Paul didn't need to be a tent maker. Okay? So, what we know is that for some reason, and here's therefore, Paul intentionally chose not to receive support at Corinth. Okay? Now, we don't really think about why doesn't when we're reading through Acts. Now, I suspect, and again, I have to know, that Acts was written after Corinthians was written. And Paul, and it could very well be that, this is kind of an interesting, I get a kick out of these kind of thought processes, to say, okay, so Luke, as he's thinking about what to write as far as the story of Paul, he knows what he says in Corinthians. He goes, okay, I got to give the backstory, and this is the backstory to what Paul is going to talk about in 2 Corinthians 9. He's going to explain that, okay? Because apparently, and I might get up in my head, there were some people that, for some reason, this did not sit well with. The fact that Paul did not take support from the Corinthians. And we'll get into that. Okay, so again, Paul is not being a tent maker simply because he loves making tents. He's doing it to survive. But as soon as there's money there from Paul and Silas and from the churches in Macedonia, he's willing to give up the tent making to devote himself exclusively to this. Okay, so Paul is not against the idea of living off of a ministry. In fact, in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks to the church, and he says, I robbed other churches. That's the word that the NIV uses. I robbed other churches to serve you. Okay, so he's taking money from the church in Macedonia so that he can live and not take money from the church in Corinth. Okay? Why? Why does he do this? Okay, again, this is a question we don't usually ask when we're looking through that particular text, and it's not a question when again, but I think Luke puts it into Acts as the backstory to what Paul's going to talk about in 1 Corinthians 9. Okay, so we go with that. Okay, so somebody is upset about the fact that Paul is not taking money. Okay, now let's think. The second thing I want to recall what we talked about last week in 1 Corinthians 8, meat offered to idols. Okay. Debbie was supposed to wear her burqa thing today, but she didn't. It would have been, I'm like, hey, where's the, she's like, not this week, maybe next week. But again, Corinthian believers were participating in cultic meals. So we kind of, again, it's speculation. I think it's a good speculation. I think it's reasonable that there's this process, that there's this religious ceremony that involves sacrificing, offering meat to these idols. And the idols, then the meat, of course, the idols having no objective reality don't eat the meat, so they serve it to the public. And Corinthian believers are going into that meal. Because again, in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, when people see you eating meat in the temple, okay, they're not talking about the Jewish temple because they're in Corinth. There's no Jewish temple in Corinth. Okay, so there's Corinthian believers in the pagan temple participating in this meal. The Corinthian believers' argument is like, well, there's no objective reality to this. What's the problem? And Paul's point at the end of 1 Corinthians 8 was that essentially, hey, just because there's no specific reason not to, doesn't make it a good idea. Okay. And this, there's this side thought I was thinking about this. One of the problems we have in church leadership, and not necessarily here, but because I've been in church leadership in a lot of different places, I never seem to learn my lesson, and I keep. But you ask somebody, you pitch an idea, say, okay, I think we should do this, and rather than people saying yes or no, they say, well, I don't have a problem with that. Which the more I think about it, the more that answer bugs me. I don't have a problem with that. Okay, and then of course, if it doesn't work out, you go, well, yeah, I knew there was something wrong with it. I just couldn't put my finger on it at the time. And people are like rats off a sinking ship, kind of stuff. It's like, well, either agree or don't. Yes or no. Do you like it or do you not like it? But it's one of those kind of deals where you'll see it. And again, I'm not, saying that this has happened in my time, this time, current go around as a deacon, where somebody's, I don't have a problem with that, But so again, it's like Paul. That's aside. That won't be on your test. All the Nobel Prizes will be on your test, but that's not going to be on your test. Okay, so Corinthian believers were participating in cultic meals, which destroyed weaker believers. Okay, and we gave the example of Marty having I think it was Marty had the friend who's Islamic and accepts the Lord and finally agrees to come out in public to come to church, and it's her first time in church, first time with believers, fellow believers. She's a new Christian, and she sees Debbie bouncing around in a brightly flowered burqa, talking about, kind of thing. What would that do to that person right at that moment? We may think it's goofy. I, of course, would not, dear. I would never say that, but Rebecca might. She, just saying. What would it do to that person in that moment? Okay, and that's what Paul is saying. So Paul says at the end, if eating meat is going to destroy my neighbor, I'm never going to eat meat again. Okay, so he says, yes, you have the right to do that. You have the right to eat the meat. There's nothing wrong with eating the meat per se, but because of this potential effect it might have, you shouldn't do it. Okay, so that's what we talked about last week. Now, 1 Corinthians 9. I know you're wondering, is he ever going to get to 1 Corinthians 9? Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. 1 Corinthians 9, what Paul is talking about is pretty clear. The question is why? Why? Paul is talking about being an apostle. Okay? Paul's rights as an apostle is just the thing I think. And he starts with a series of questions which assume a yes answer. So circle the why. Okay? He's not answering, he's not asking, he's not looking for information here. He's seeking to kind of make a point here, okay? Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Okay, so he begins with a series of questions, all demanding a yes. And again, there is this conflict going between his authority and the church. Again, this is kind of getting back to a deeper problem that they had Apollos, they had Peter. Some follow Paul, some follow Peter, some follow Cephas. Remember, we talked about that in the earlier chapters. So you still have that problem in the background. And Paul is clearly saying, look, the fact that you even exist is because of me. Okay, I'm the one that came there. I'm the one that started that church. I'm the one that brought the gospel to you. Okay, am I not this? And now he says here, one of the things, are you not the result of, let's see, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? So Paul says in verse 1, have I not seen Jesus our Lord? So the question is this a criterion now for being an apostle? Okay. Does seeing the Lord, is that the criterion or a criteria for being a criterion for being an apostle? Well, you go back to Acts chapter 1, and I give the passage there in Acts chapter 1:21, when Peter is talking about replacing Judas. And he says, we need to find somebody who's been with us all during the time that Jesus was on earth in order to replace Judas as an apostle. Okay? So is that the criteria? Being with him, seeing the Lord, being, all those, are those the criteria? I have to keep my singular plural straight here. Are those the criteria? Okay. Well, remember when we talked about Acts, I mentioned that there really isn't a strong argument to say that what Peter was doing there was the right thing to do. There's nothing wrong with it. They're just sitting around there waiting for something to happen and going, well, we probably should replace Judas. The trouble is you're only going to have so many people that were with, and at some point the apostolic line is going to die out if that's your criteria. That's your reason. I have to pick a different word. It's getting too hard to keep criteria and criterion straight. If that's going to be your rule of thumb, sooner or later the apostolic line is going to die out, and that is a point of doctrine for a lot of churches. That once the last person who had seen Jesus on the face of the earth died out, there are no more apostles. Okay? Yes?
I'm thinking of a word that I learned way back in the confirmation class, when they talked about the requirements to be an apostle, and because you use the word see Jesus, and I remember learning the word commissioned by Jesus. So if you didn't follow him in his earthly life, but Paul, Jesus came to him in a vision, and was basically commissioned. It's not just seeing, but...
I'm not sure what your question is. Well, let me finish and then see if I answer your question here. Okay, so the question is, when does Paul see Jesus? Well, there's a couple of ideas here. There's actually three ideas. Okay, one is he may have seen him while he was alive. Okay, Jesus and Paul are about the same age. Okay, Jesus was in Jerusalem. Paul might have been in Jerusalem. Paul might have been in the crowd. There's no, again, it's an argument from the silence. Okay, there's no text that says this. Okay, but it's possible. Okay, but even if he had, I don't think it's going to be something that qualifies him. There's also another passage, and we'll talk about it. I don't know if I can't remember if it's in 1st or 2nd Corinthians, where Paul talks about, man went up to the higher heavens for 14 years kind of thing. Some have argued that's Paul. I don't think it is. Some argue that it is. Or the more obvious sense is on the road to Damascus. I mean, clearly he's talking to Jesus, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you persecute, kind of thing. It's hard to kick against the pricks, as the King James puts it, kind of thing. So he sees Jesus there. So he has a vision where he sees the risen Lord. So whether or not that is a criterion to be an apostle, Paul certainly believes it qualifies him to be an apostle. Now, I don't necessarily think that the apostolic line has died out, or that there aren't. I mean, because Paul says God gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers, kind of thing, and that's a whole nother fun can of worms that we can get into some other time. But Paul said again, Paul isn't necessarily saying that, okay, in order to be an apostle, you have to have seen physically, oh, Jesus, there he is, over there, Not necessarily. Perhaps there you're getting into the idea of being commissioned. Then you get into the question, okay, so what does that mean? How do you prove, verify, say that you have been commissioned? I mean, Paul's got this whole big event that he can point back to. With people, some said it thundered. That's a different event. Where you got all the people who saw the light, and some heard the noise, some didn't, kind of stuff. But so Paul is just using this, again, because he's sensitive about his apostolic authority here, especially relative to the church in Corinth. Okay? But he's pointing, this is my defense. So to me, is this a criterion for being an apostle? To me, well, maybe. But Paul definitely thinks it qualifies, at least in part, him. It qualifies him. Okay? Now, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. So again, there are people that are sitting in judgment for Paul. So 9:3 suggests that someone is judging Paul. Don't we have the right to food and drink? So let me make a point to you here. Okay? Don't we, and here I think he's talking about the apostles, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas? Again, that Cephas is Peter. That's just the Latin name. I'm not sure why. Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? And this is kind of part of the problem, I think. You know, others came through and had no problem accepting money from the Corinthian believers. Paul comes through and won't. Okay. Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier? And again, starting with verse 7, we have another series of questions. The questions in verses 1 through 10 all lead to the conclusion that workers should be paid. Okay? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And this is from Deuteronomy 25. Okay, don't muzzle the ox while it's treading the grain. So don't put an ox who eats grain in the middle of a grain field and then drive it nuts because it can't eat anything. You know, it's kind of the same thing if you're on a diet, a serious diet, don't go to a smorgasbord restaurant. Okay, just save yourself the trouble. Okay, is it about the oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? So again, Paul is looking at that these verses, these rules in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and elements of the law. There's a bigger picture. It isn't just a question that God is up there thinking, I really got this thing about protecting oxen. So let's, Again, he's saying this is indicative of this larger principle that the laborer is worthy of his hire. Okay. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, it is written for us, was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. Okay. So again, that kind of makes sense, right? And I think this is one of those issues that's, when some of these concepts and some of the principles behind Paul's argument here are some of the same principles and concepts behind, like when you talk about the fight for 15 with the income inequality things in the U.S. and in the world, for that matter. Some of the same concepts. You've got people who are working and can't have a decent lifestyle. One of the things that Henry Ford was given great credit for was the $5 day, which at the time was huge. So Henry Ford created the Model T and was building and was having trouble getting employees or the union things and union busts and stuff going on, and people were coming and going, and there was a lot of competition in the car business. And Henry Ford, Henry Ford was a horrific anti-Semite and had a lot of other weirdnesses to him, but occasionally he could be a genius. And in this situation, he realized that I need to create a way that both I can keep employees and sell cars. And so whereas the average pay at that time was like $2 a day, Henry Ford said, okay, my employees that make my Model Ts are going to get paid $5 a day, double pay. So you can imagine if you pick a restaurant that's got a help wanted sign out front, McDonald's. If that McDonald's said, okay, we're going to pay $30 an hour, do you think they'd have trouble getting employees? Not as long as everyone else is paying $15, okay? But once he started paying $5 a day, that not only did it take care of his employee problem, in terms of retention problem, the employees could afford the cars they were building. Okay. Now it's not all that good. I mean, there was he had some rules and strictures and things, and he created like a police force to make sure that people were living up to his standards. It's like if you're gonna, sort of along the line of if you've ever read about like George Pullman, Pullman cars and the Pullman town and all of that. Similar ideas. Like, yeah, you can write $5. I'll pay you $5 a day, no problem. But you have to dot this I and cross this T and go to church on Sundays and all that kind of stuff. And I literally had people that were doing that. But the concept is, 31 years with Ford, it's an easy rabbit trail, okay? But the idea was that people that are working should be able to take advantage of things. Now, that doesn't mean that, if you work as a mechanic on making 747s, that you should get paid enough that you can afford a 747. But a decent lifestyle, and that's kind of Paul's point. If you work at something, you should be able to benefit from it. And he brings the conclusion, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? Now, Paul has already said, you are my spiritual seed. I clearly had the fact that you exist is my spiritual seed. Shouldn't I have benefited from that? Okay? If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? Okay? But we did not use this right. So Paul is making it very clear. I had every right to take support from you. Okay? But I didn't. Okay? Check my second question. Paul gets to his point. I worked with you. I deserved to be paid by you. But in 9:12, we did not use this right, or later on he's going to say any of these rights, to take support from you. Okay? Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Okay, so why do we pay pastors? Well, here you go. Here you got an injunction. It's like they're going to make their living from it, should pay for it. But I have not used any of these rights, verse 15. And I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. So he's not trying to settle a score here. Okay? Actually, verse 9:13 alludes back to the question of food obtained from temples. Just kind of, hold that thought. And in verse 15, Paul is not making this argument to collect a debt. He's not saying, listen, you guys owe me, right? For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. And this is kind of interesting when Paul talks about being compelled. Well, my next thing is, Paul is thus free because he belongs to no one. Which brought me to mind the whole idea of the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Okay? There's a long-standing tradition in the church that not the church in general, that every once in a while you'll get a church that has a singular big giver in the church. Somebody who is a big giver in the church, and everybody knows it. And the leadership knows it. And the pastor knows it. Okay? And suddenly it can be that your ministry starts to be controlled by that person. Well, Debbie gives a huge amount of money to the church, and all I'm saying is that every service better have some statement about gardening in it, or she's going to take her plants and walk. Debbie is not the big giver. Are you? Are you hiding something from me here? No. You think she'd let me know? No. So there's a story that Rick Warren writes in his first book, Purpose Driven Church, where he talks about starting Saddleback. When he started Saddleback, they had a group of like 10 or 12 people, and there was one person in the church that was clearly a big giver in the group. That was clearly a big giver. And the person wanted to control things. And he talks about how difficult that was, and he finally just said, you got to go. And he cut his income significantly in the church. Okay, but his point was, once that guy was out of the church, that family, whatever it was, once that guy was out of the church, he was able to create a ministry much better because he didn't have to focus on pleasing this one particular guy. That's the problem of having a church support, is that you're kind of, well, wait a minute, can I preach something that's going to result in losing half of my givers? Okay? That's just kind of the reality of it here. And Paul, so something about the Corinthians, Paul said, if I took your money, you would think you controlled me. And so he doesn't. He knew them, or he knew them enough to know, I don't want to be in debt to these guys. Paul is thus free because he belongs to no one. Paul is compelled to preach the gospel. And I think the word compelled here just means it's like, this was not my idea. Okay, the Gordon Fee in his commentary says, this is not like the person who's got an itch to preach. Okay, as I keep going back to, I just knew a pastor one time I was talking to who said on the same day, he had an interview, a conversation with a husband and a wife. Okay, the husband came in first, and the husband came in to tell the pastor that he felt God was calling him to preach. And then a couple hours later, the wife comes in to say that she doesn't think her husband is saved. So, figure that one out. You know, this was just one of those kind of things that pastors talk about. Hey, let me tell you about these two guys I had, you know. Called to preach, I don't think he's a believer, okay? It's like, well, you know, one of you two are not communicating well with the other. But again, Paul is like, listen, I'm compelled to be. I had to be knocked off a horse and blinded for 3 days for me to see the light, okay? Though I am free and belong to no one, verse 19, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Paul knew that his taking the Corinthian church's money would lead to their control and would negatively affect his ability to minister here in Corinth. And his big principle that he puts out here is, you probably heard this text before, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. Again, because he's dealing with mostly Gentiles. He wants to really separate out that whole, where the law fits into this. So as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Anybody heard that verse before? Become all things to all men, that I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. Okay? Paul's point here is, I had the right to take money from you. I did not. I gave up that right. In 2 Corinthians, he says, I robbed other churches to serve you, because he knew that would negatively affect his ability to minister. So when you start thinking about, why is Paul going into this? This is an illustration of the point he's making in chapter 8. You have the right to eat that meat. You have the right to go there. Don't. Paul had the right. Paul is giving an illustration. Look, I'm telling you guys not to do something you have the right to do. Let me explain to you in your midst something that I had the right to do in order to minister to you that I didn't do. Okay, so 8 and 9 go together. Okay, so this is one of the things that to me, is my goal in this kind of class. See, we have a tendency, and again, this is a frequently repeated gripe. I get it, I understand. That we tend to atomize the text. We tend to break it apart, and we all know I become all things to all men that I might win some. Right? Has anybody not heard that text before in a sermon or something like this? Now, how many of you ever heard this as, this is his explanation for why they shouldn't eat meat offered to idols? But that's what it is. He's like, this is an example. In your midst, you saw it happen, but I was doing it to minister to you. Now, this may have been insulting to the Corinthians, because the Corinthians probably, especially the ones writing the letter, might have thought, well, you know, we're believers. We don't need to be ministered to. So, heathens. But Paul recognized that, hey, you guys are not nearly at the level you think you are. And I knew that if I was taking your money, there would have been, oh, you know, whoever has the goal makes the rules. Yeah, here's your paycheck. By the way, can you dial back the talk about this in your sermons and a little more talk about gardens? This is Debbie. This is how Debbie would do it. Just get the, right there. Just kidding. Okay. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. So Paul is compelled to preach the gospel. So there's a reason Paul doesn't accept support in Corinth. And that's what it is. He knows there's something about the Corinthian people, the Corinthian believers, that had he taken their support, they would have wanted to control him. And he wasn't going to have that. And as a result, he was able to minister there for a year and a half in the church. And then when Paul talks about this, all things to all men, Paul strategically becomes all things to all, that he might save some. Okay, so for Paul to do this, these are strategic decisions he's making. This isn't a Paul's statement here, all things to all men, is not a license to do whatever you want. Okay, Paul says, listen, if I'm in an area where I need money and it's not going to bother me, I'm going to take the church's money because it's his right. Okay, but there's an example of where I did not. I gave up that right. I became a tent maker so that I could minister to you in a way that I would not have been able to minister to you if you were paying my salary. Kind of thing. Finally, he finishes up chapter 9, and I'll finish with this, with another famous passage, well-known passage. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Now, this was before the day of participation trophies and finishers medals. I was thinking, I know it doesn't surprise any of you, but I have completed a marathon. I don't necessarily claim to have run a marathon. I've completed a marathon. It's now going on a dozen years ago, but the participant's medal is still hanging out there where I can see it. But do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Okay, do this to win. Okay, Paul is in the Christian life to win. Okay, he's not looking for a participation or a finisher's medal, participation trophy. Although I've got my 1973 Bolingbrook Little League participation trophy is still on my shelf. I will confess that. I don't know why. I just can't bring myself to throw it out. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Okay, so therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. That's how I run, running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Okay. Our reward is a crown. Okay, Paul states 9:24 that we should run the race in such a way to win. Our reward is a crown that will last forever. Paul's final thought here, just as Paul gave up his right to support in Corinth, they should give up their right to temple meat for the sake, that is, the progress of the gospel. Next week, we're going to tie this back into the history. It's going to give some warnings. And so today is the 10th. Next week is the 17th. So yes, we will have a ABF next week. But not the 24th and not the 31st kind of thing. So any questions?
Just one. So this way of tying 8 and 9 together,
Mm-hmm.
in the broad scheme of the way we do Bible reading, that the way of looking at this is not, when people argue with you like, oh, we shouldn't read it that way. And because this makes total, you presented it, makes total sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I'm sorry, I can't even put a sentence in. But would there be people who'd say, no, we can't read it the way you just presented it? Because the way that we tend to chop up our scripture reading and
Are there people who would disagree?
we've never heard from the pulpit.
8 and 9 are tied.
is
8 and 9 are tied together. I don't know that anybody would stake out an argument and say, oh, I think, every book you ever read on Bible study will say, look at the whole text, look at the whole book, look at the whole purpose. Everyone said, and again, this is one of those, like Mark Twain once said, a classic is a book that many praise but few read. And I think this is Mark Twain Day. I don't know, but I think to me it's just one of those things. Like everybody knows this, but as far as actually putting it into practice, because it's so much easier to just look at a verse and go, "Run that you may obtain." All right, let's talk about running. Right. And you get a lot of stories about running and athletes and all that kind of stuff. And and again, is that is that wrong? It doesn't always lead to a wrong conclusion, and that's part of the problem. You're taking a verse out of context. Taking a verse out of context doesn't inexorably lead to a wrong conclusion, and we do that all the time. It happens all the time. People take verses out and say, I read this verse in the Bible, and that clearly says I need to love my mother, which of course is a great thing. I love my mother, okay, and but that's not what that verse is talking about. But it's hard to go. If you argue and say, well, that's not really what that verse is talking about. It's like, oh, so you don't love your mother? No, I'm just saying that you don't love this text, kind of thing. So I don't think there's anybody that would explicitly disagree with me. It's just the practice to me is like, okay, well, why,
You keep getting.
Yeah.
You keep pushing, which is very good. Because previously, previous chapters, when you said Paul was addressing specific congregational issues in Corinth, and it isn't necessarily a big
Right.
theological or doctrinal statement. And I was like, oh, I went home and I'm like, guess what I learned today? Yeah. And it's very freeing, and it helps, it's intimidating because you think, now what am I reading wrong? Because there's always like, tell me what I'm doing wrong or not thinking right, and that way. But
Well, it happens to me as well. I'm looking at this going, and even driving up here before we started talking about imperialism, I was like, that was topic B. I just said, it's like, yeah, I've never. The reason why you don't get that is because it takes a lot more work to understand that point than it does to just read a passage. And again, the verses, the Bible is, our Bibles have already separated it all out for us, and they've done all the thinking for us. And so it's a lot easier to just go, okay, what is this verse? I'm going to open the Bible. Okay, what does God have for me today? And you read a passage and you go, oh, that means I ought to love my mother. Great, I'm done. And the next day we forget what the verse before was or the verse after and all that kind of stuff. And, to me, every preacher in the world talks about context. Everyone. They all talk about context. And to me, context is so much huger. More huge? Bigger. I'm going to edit that part out. So much bigger than simply what was the verse before and what was the verse after. It's kind of like, who is he talking to? And again, with Corinthians, any of Paul's epistles, you always have to start thinking, who is he talking to? What is the occasion? How does it apply in that day? You just have to understand what it meant to say, okay, well, to what extent does that apply today? And how is that going to make a difference in my day today, kind of thing. Any other questions? I'm not going anywhere until 10:30, so. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.